Good morning, SREcon. Very, very happy to be here with my people. As Pat said, I may be the youngest retired SRE, but through the conversations I've had so far, I've started to realize you don't ever really stop being an SRE. Once you learn how to think in systems and care about resiliency, it's kind of just in your nature. Again, Paige Cruz, I work for Chronosphere, and I'm very, very happy to share what I have called the best meeting on my calendar. Our roadmap for today, we'll talk about the origins of Alert Triage Hour of Power, in which case I said I'm on call for what? We'll get into the roles, the responsibilities, walk through what the meeting flow looks like so you can get some takeaways for your org. We'll talk about the findings, the lessons learned, the stuff that we gathered from a year of facilitating this. In part 4, we'll relate this all back to that very fancy academic term, cognitive apprenticeship. And not to bury the lead, it literally is just a word for learning in context in the real world for experts to share their learnings with novices. And then part 5, we'll wrap up with the outcomes for the organization, and away we go. So, when I joined my first early-ish stage startup as an SRE, I was shocked to find out there was one on-call rotation for everything, all of it. And that was my face, basically. I said, well, I'm an SRE. I'm learning about our infrastructure. I'm learning about our CI/CD system, our build tooling, our monitoring setup, learning about orchestration, the cloud, handling internal tools, and just trying to understand the critical workflows at a high level for the system. I'm not spending intimate time with any individual service, any individual language or framework, and I felt pretty uncomfortable holding the pager for everything. Why wasn't anyone else stressed about this? Well, at the time, the company had a very low attrition rate, and so that meant the engineers that were working alongside me were able to build up over the course of several years from humble beginnings, a small system, into the complex, beautiful beast that I walked into. So, and additionally, they were software engineers, and so they worked on the code every day. They were familiar with these services, and due to our flexible organization, people switched teams a lot, so they got broad exposure to most parts of the system. So that's why most of my peers were totally fine with this global on-call rotation to rule them all. And our on-call onboarding was pretty typical for organizations that don't have a dedicated learning and development department. It looked a little something like this. You'd get shown some tactical documentation, how to request an override, how to set up pager duty, maybe a long incident response document, step by step. Then your onboarding buddy would walk you through what you needed to know in the 3 months that you were considered to be onboarding. And I noticed that how prepared and confident you felt picking up the pager was highly dependent on who your onboarding buddy was and how well they were equipped to train and explain things. We don't tend to hire engineers for their mentoring ability. It's more for the technical, tactical stuff. And so this was a gap that I noticed from new engineers that were joining the rotation. Finally, you would get ready to go on call. At some point in those 3 months, you had picked up enough knowledge, hopefully, to shadow the primary. You would be paged when they'd be paged. You'd kind of ride along and see how they investigated and handled stuff, and generally what you should do with your time, primary on call. Then we would do something called a reverse shadow, where the new person would be the primary on call, and their secondary didn't act like a secondary. They actually acted like another primary. They were there as backup. They got paged at the same time, so you knew that your first shift on call, you had somebody watching your back. And that was it. Ta-da! After 3 months, your formal onboarding phase had ended, and you were kind of just a part of the rotation like everybody else. And I thought, what would it take for me to feel this confident and comfortable going into this rotation? Aside from refactoring the on-call monolith, which we did do successfully and is a totally different talk, so the more I thought about it, I was like, gosh, to be confident and comfortable on call, there's really a few different buckets of skills and knowledge that you need to blend together. So I took a stab at disambiguating those. We've got knowledge of the system, knowledge of your telemetry, and a business context. So we'll double click into each of these. Of course, you've got to know the technical aspects of your system. That's understanding the application layer, your language frameworks, your language runtimes, the infrastructure, on-prem, in the cloud, hybrid. Are you running with containers? Do you have an orchestrator? How many environments are there? You've got to be familiar with the release process, specifically for on-call. You want to know how to do a rollback. You want to know if your org does roll forwards, and how to do an emergency hotfix, okay? Then you got to put all of those pieces together to get some sort of comprehensive overall view of the system architecture. Great. Step 1, get to know your system. Step 2 would not be a Paige talk if I didn't talk about telemetry and observability. What do we got going on? Do we have traces? Do we have events? That'd be lovely. Do we have logs? I know you have logs, and I know you have metrics, but I was mostly curious about traces and events. Do you have a mix? Do you have none? That would be scary. Are you instrumenting via proprietary agents and libraries? Are you joining us in the beautiful world of open source with OpenTelemetry and Prometheus? What query language does that observability tool use? What's the metric namespacing look like? And finally, are there tags or attributes that are really critical to the business that would be really helpful to facet or group by when looking at a bunch of events or spans? Maybe team owner, maybe customer tier. You got to learn that stuff. And once you've got those two things sorted, time to get into the business context. Where's all this telemetry going? One tool? Multiple tools? How do you know where to go for what? How do you acclimate to the radically different UXs between the tools? How about that alert hygiene? Do you have good runbooks? Do you have any runbooks? Is there some notion of a service catalog or a developer portal or one place where you can go to find who owns what? Are unactionable alerts ruthlessly vanquished, or do you have channels that just have spammy alerts that are just our default? You can ignore those, don't worry about them. And finally, this big one of who owns what, or rather, what is that line of responsibility between a software development team and an SRE team and an operations team? Where is their partnership? Where is their full ownership? What is that relationship between back-end and front-end engineers, storage and ingest? What services are orphaned and by default owned by ops? These are all the things that go through my mind when I'm joining a new rotation. So with visions of Sub-1s dancing through my head, my staff software engineer, Sarah Haskins, said, hey, I think I've got an idea here. And she pitched me a vision of me being confident on call, ready to take the pager, and alert triage hour of power was thus born. So what is it exactly in a nutshell? It's a 1-hour meeting held twice a month, explicitly for the purpose of learning how to observe, query, inspect, analyze our system. We would follow an investigation of a low urgency alert, not anything paging, just one of those annoying alerts that flapped or something the primary didn't have time to address. We would follow investigation all the way from the alert link and pager duty through an understanding of what caused it, and at the end wrap up with figuring out if we should recommend to keep, tune, or delete it. If you're familiar with pair programming or mob programming, this is a very, very similar concept with a couple nuances. And this is a very wise quote from a very wise SRE that alert triage is the most valuable meeting on my calendar. So what made it that way? Well, first, we had structure. This was not a free-for-all. This was not everybody jumping in to solve the problem. We had explicit roles: a facilitator, a driver, a scribe, and the support crew. Our facilitator, they were the seasoned engineer. They had seen things, they had built this system, they'd survived some incidents. They were there to guide this whole process. They would select an alert, and again, the purpose of this was for learning. So they would choose a low urgency alert, always in the production environment, because we wanted there to be some real stakes involved. They would help us stay on track, avoid rabbit holes and yak shaving and bike shedding. kind of helping people stay focused because, again, it's a 1-hour meeting. We'd like to respect people's time. They set the tone for the entire investigation. I noticed lots of differences between facilitators, and so we worked on ways to make sure every meeting was a safe space for learning. And finally, part of that learning is protecting those last 10 minutes for the recap, the synthesis, the what did we really do here with this hour. Then we had the driver. This was the funnest role. This was the student, the learner, the novice. They were here just to learn. They had a few responsibilities, which was making sure they advocated for their learning needs. In some cases, people were totally fine to have lots of voices diving in with hypotheses and questions and check out this link. Some people could totally roll with that. Oop, I was not one of them. I get a little bit of sensory overload when there's a lot of voices coming at me. And so I would ask the group, respectfully, for a little bit of silence while I was thinking through what I wanted to do for the next step. And that worked out great, and that was how I protected my learning needs. But it was not a silent process. We did have a responsibility that the person who was learning externalized their thought process. Because how else are we supposed to guide you if we don't know what you're thinking or where you're stuck on? So that was something that we helped people and we coached them through. And on a similar vein, knowing when to ask for help. This is a really difficult skill, especially the more senior that we get and we get more exposure to things and we think we know a lot. So breaking through that tunnel vision, it was really good to train people, hey, this is a great time to ask for help. The Scribe, I love documentation, I love writing down learnings, I love sharing them, and so the Scribe is secretly a very, very critical role in this whole process. They were there to capture the learnings for the sessions. Importantly, they were there to ask for clarification. So when you would have a cacophony of voices saying, oh, I think it's this, have you checked the database? The Scribe would say, whoa, hey, give me a link to that dashboard, or can you repeat what you think the problem is, so that they could write it down. That's a really important role to make sure we're all on the same page. And finally, sharing is caring. We published this to our internal wiki, Confluence, which, small soapbox, I do think that Confluence and wikis are the most underutilized SRE tools. We can debate that later. So sharing is caring, share the learnings out. And finally, the support crew. These were folks who enjoyed attending. They got value out of it in learnings, whether or not they were the one driving. And we tried to choose a range of perspectives, both junior, mid, senior staff engineers, so we could get a range of people's approaches and experience. We asked for folks from the front end, the back end, storage, ingest. We found that the more voices we had in the room, the better and more crisp our mental model became, and the easier it was for us to hop around the system and find connections. And it's kind of in the name, right? Support. They were there to cheerlead. They weren't there to be silent and judgy. Nobody wants to walk into a group and try and solve a problem if they think they're being judged pretty harshly by their very smart peers. So it's very important that the support staff was there to offer words of encouragement. Oh, we've been there. You know, we're just not born knowing this stuff. So what did a typical meeting look like? We would set our meeting intention and the roles in the first 10 minutes and pick our alert and responder. Part of setting the meeting intention was to explicitly say, every single meeting, we are here for learning. You do not have homework. There is nothing, no action you need to take after this meeting aside from being present and playing your role. The facilitator would pick an alert. Most of the time they did that beforehand, kind of scanning, you know, what was flapping that day, what looked kind of interesting. And we would pick out a responder. Sometimes we would try to make sure that the alert we picked was relevant to a service that that person owned, but sometimes it was a good learning experience to find your way around the system with a new alert. The bulk of our time was spent lovingly investigating why the heck this alert went off, was it even valid, and what do we want to do about it? What have we learned? So we would start literally from, you know, the acking the page and PagerDuty. We would send the facilitator a link, they would share their screen on the Zoom, and we would all follow along as they popped over to their alert definition. And something we had to add about halfway through, because we were looking at these low urgency alerts that were mostly ignored, they weren't always formed right. And so we learned not trust but verify and then trust the alert. We treated them with a little bit of skepticism. So what we would actually do is have the driver look through the alert and tell us, read it out loud. What do you see here? Okay, well, it looks like we're grabbing latency, the requests that took less than 500 milliseconds to the ordering service for the operation list orders for the past 6 hours, summing those up, dividing it by, let's see, the total requests to ordering service list orders, regardless of how long it took or whatever the latency was. And then we're rolling that all up into a latency burn rate. Whoa, right? Once you start reading this stuff out loud and having to comprehend it, a lot of knowledge gaps would come up, and it was a really great time to explain metric queries. So we'd say, what is this alert titled? What does it say? What do you think the query is expressing? Do you think that what the title says and what the query is, are those valid? Do those match up? And where do you want to go from here? Because this is where we spend most of our time. Running through all of the different possibilities. We would look at traces during the time window. We would look at service dashboards. We would look at run books if we were lucky. And really just go through this loop of having the driver come up with a hypothesis, go to our observability tooling, check that hypothesis, and kind of over and over until we developed what we thought was a good understanding of what caused that alert to trigger. And like I said, that most important time is those last 10 minutes for wrap-up and synthesis. We'd recap the journey. We started with this alert. This is what we discovered. Oh, maybe it wasn't valid. And we come to this decision point. Because the part of the purpose was preparing someone for on-call. They would be triaging alerts. They would be at this decision point once they were primary. So what do? Well, there's 3 options in my mind once we went through the investigation and kind of figured out the series of events. We would ask the driver what their recommendation was. We said, we may not implement it, right? But we want to know at this point, with what you've discovered, would you keep this alert as it is? Would you tune it? Would you tweak it? Too sensitive, not sensitive enough? Why are we using an average? That sort of thing. Or my personal favorite, let's just delete this alert. Is this alert we don't even need? Get rid of it. So this is what on-call onboarding looked like after. It was pretty much the same with the exception of attending this alert triage. It was totally optional. I think most of us know when you try to affect organizational change, just because you write it in a wiki doesn't mean it's policy or anyone will do it. So we highly recommended that folks join first as a support, just so they could get the lay of the land, know what the tools were, be familiar with the folks, and not have such a scary introduction as being expected to solve something on their first time. After they joined us for a couple sessions, they were ready to become the driver. They felt comfortable, they had gotten their logins. We would have them conduct an investigation. And finally, again, pair with the buddy, do the shadows, and ta-da, you are free to be on call now. With one important point, which is that alert triage continued to persist, and that open invitation stayed open no matter if you were staff, junior, you'd worked there 5 years or 6 months. So it wasn't really the end to onboarding per se, but it was the end of their gentle introduction. So what did we learn after a year of running this program, after 24 times of this meeting? Our staff engineer, APK, really came up with this mantra that alerts are not precious. We noticed that people had this apprehension not only to tune and tweak the alert, but deleting it was just totally not on the table for some people. And APK and I were like, oh my gosh, what do we do here? And so he started to say, alerts are not precious. They are not precious. We can delete them. So this is a slide to remind you. This baby Kriya, a Wakaya alpaca, is precious. Your alert that woke you up, that was meaningless, not precious. Okay. We learned that learning is a worthwhile goal in and of itself. I will tell you, I will confess that I secretly had dreams that this meeting would be the thing that would rebalance our alerts. It would get rid of all those spammy alerts. People just needed to see what this triaging loop was, and then they would just, go off and do it, right? No, as I found out. And over time, I thought, well, gosh, we've got this core group of people that keep coming to this meeting. I get tremendous value out of learning from my peers. They seem to find value. Maybe learning is a good enough goal for itself. We also learned that active listening is very difficult, turns out. A lot of the folks who were seasoned had all of the knowledge, the skills, and the experience, but they weren't totally equipped to guide somebody. They were more used to telling people, this is what to do, this is the action. And so we had to learn, one of the papers had a really great phrase. It was, you want to be a guide on the side, not a sage on the stage. So this was something that we really developed with the more senior folks in our organization, to be the guide on the side. Don't tell them the answer, but teach them how to fish. And again, look at this precious baby. Did you know that babies don't even know how to smile when they're born? Like wild. This baby definitely does not know PromQL. We're not born knowing this stuff. We're not born knowing how to monitor, how to operate systems at scale. And it's not totally taught in college as far as I can tell. So where else are these engineers supposed to learn good, proper, confident on-call habits, if not on the job? And again, this is to represent all of the surprises that production brought us during this meeting. From the senior SREs to the staff software engineers, we were shocked every single meeting. Every single meeting, someone would say, didn't know the system worked like that. Huh, didn't know those two things talk to each other. Oh, that's how you query. It was constant learning for every participant in the group. And particularly beneficial for staff software engineers who had worked with the system for a while. You start to develop a comfortability, you start to think you know everything, and then production schooled us, like I said, every time. So, in a nutshell, our findings were that alerts are not precious, that active listening is tricky, it's a skill that you need to work on and develop, that learning is a worthy goal, that alert triaging, not an innate skill, and that production can surprise everybody. Okay. So what's all this about cognitive apprenticeship? We threw this fancy psychological term out here. What does this mean? I didn't have the words for this until a PDX DevOps Ground-Up meetup last year, when I learned that what we had been doing all along with alert triage was actually cognitive apprenticeship. The philosophy emphasizing learning in context, focused on knowledge transfer from expert to novice. You can think about apprenticeships mostly in the trades and sort of like physical work and crafting. I think about glass blowing. You could read all the books in the world about material science, the art of glass blowing, the history, and if you walked into a hot shop having just read all of that, I don't think you'd make a good wine glass. It's very also risky to embark on without proper guidance. There's a lot that could go wrong there. And so that's the apprentice part of the term. And a note on apprenticeship, not mentorship. Mentorship is when you give advice from your perspective based on your experience, tailored to your mentee and adapted for their situations. You are advising, and apprenticeship is the teaching of a skill. It is all about the learner getting the knowledge that you have. Okay, so that's the apprentice part. What about this cognitive part? What the heck is up with this? Well, we're not actually teaching a physical, tangible skill. I can't point to, I can point to a rug I knitted and say, I made that. I could point to a dashboard, I guess, and say, ooh, I made this. But what we're really teaching, right, is the thought process, the pattern, the triaging loop. We're teaching people how to inspect our systems. So that's where the cognitive part comes in. It's a thought process. And so there's 6 stages to this cognitive apprenticeship from apprentice to expert. You've got modeling, where your expert is going to show how it's done. I'll show you the proper way. This is how I look at alerts. There's coaching, where the novice they replicate. They say, oh, let me give it a try. I'll try. And the expert's guiding them along. Oh, let's look at what that alert query actually is. I don't think it's telling us what I think. Scaffolding. And this is where the expert may have to do some parts of the exercise for the novice, because maybe the novice isn't skilled yet. Articulation, this is the process of making that implicit explicit. Where are you stuck? What are you thinking right now? And bringing those out loud helps you clarify and expose these ideas. It's very similar to rubber ducking. A really lovely part is reflection, taking a step back to admire your progress, see how far you've come, and look at where you're going. And probably the best part is the end. You graduated, you're ready to explore the big world, you're ready to break all the rules of grammar with your poetry. This is you at your best. You have now become the expert. Okay, let's map this to alert triage. Well, modeling, this would be when we had a staff engineer take over the driver role. They would say, all right, I'm gonna look at this alert. They would lead us through their very tailored path that had been worked on over years and years of operational work. And it was a joy to watch our staff engineers troubleshoot. It was very valuable to get to ask them in the moment, hey, how'd you know to query for that metric? How'd you know that tag was there? And you wouldn't always get a satisfactory answer. Sometimes it was like, I bookmarked it from the last incident, but it made that visible. It made us realize our staff engineers were not these magical wizards. They were very technical engineers that we could become by sharing our learnings. Coaching, that would be when we would have the facilitator kind of direct and say, oh, let's look at the alert definition. Oh, I don't think that's a good path to go down. Let's go back to your earlier hypothesis. Scaffolding kind of came to play in a couple various ways, but it would really depend on what the learner needed. Sometimes folks came to us with no knowledge of tracing, so we'd have to lay the groundwork, and maybe we would do a little bit more instruction, like, click on that exemplar that is 900 milliseconds at 10:30 a.m., and we'd walk them through the trace waterfall. Articulation, that was our part at the end with the recap. What did we learn? Where did this investigation take us through the nooks and crannies of production? Reflection, this one happened for folks individually on their own, but I also did make sure to take time to do one-on-one conversations with some of the regular attendees to make sure they were getting what they needed out of it and their learning needs were being met. And like I said, the best part is watching these little baby birdies fly out into the beautiful sky and explore, initiate independent investigations. I saw a lot higher quality conversations in our channels. People were able to say, hey, I saw something alerting for your team. I took a little look. Here's a breadcrumb for you to start pulling on. Pretty awesome. So we've talked about a terrified Paige entering a global on-call rotation. We talked about the birth of Alert Triage Hour of Power. We've learned, surprise, it's cognitive apprenticeship. But what came of it? What was the value for our organization? Here's some results for you. We reached 1,000% uptime. We had a 50% reduction in unactionable alerts, full runbook coverage, and infinite reliability. That's good stuff. Obviously not. Quantifying the impact of this practice was really tricky, turns out. But we're SREs, and in our heart of hearts, we need a way to measure things. The things that we know to be valuable to the org. And if you have not yet seen Neil Murphy's conversation, it's a YouTube video, IC meets VP, explaining incident management. Delivered it at the Learning from Incidents conference earlier this year. I think he put it best, this tension that I felt. We'll only walk through just one quick snippet of the conversation. And I will not do the accent, I'm not good at those. So Mr. VP says, hey, we invested a lot in incident management last quarter, and our incidents went up. Is that expected? Mr. IC says, no, well, it's not that we're finding more incidents. It's really more that we're trying to handle them better. And the investment really did help our team to do that. And Mr. VB goes, really? Here it says not only did we have more incidents, but they lasted longer on average. Whew. And Mr. VP has a point, right? Sort of. There's serious investment of time and energy for engineers. They are not the most expensive. They're not the cheapest person in our organizations, and our engineering time is so very precious. So we return to this question. what is the return, what is the ROI of alert triage power hour for an organization? Here's what I can tell you. It is going 3 years strong. This practice has survived, This practice has survived me leaving the company, Sarah leaving the company. It has grown from about 5 regular attendees to 15 to 20. It's expanded past engineering. Now product managers and UX designers attend to see what it's like for engineers in the real context using the application, and they're using it to inform their understanding of observability. And I did track the alert volume because I was very concerned in this organization about alert fatigue. And I did find a 0 reduction in spammy alerts over time because the point was learning. And I really just had to see the numbers to make that work out. So what I can also say is that Margaret, one of our most faithful attendees, took over stewardship of this meeting after we left. She has taken it far beyond where Sarah and I could have dreamed. And when I asked Margaret about this practice, and I said, I'm coming to SREcon, what's on your mind about this? What can you tell me? She said that it wasn't just me who said it was the best meeting on their calendars, but people say that, and that the legacy lives on, and new engineers are always stoked about it. That's what it was about. That was the goal. Confident, comfortable, on-call operators who are excited to dive into the system and learn how to use our observability tooling, taking all of our perspectives together and managing this thing we call production. So, with that, thank you very much. You can find me You can find me on the interwebs at Hachyderm, LinkedIn, Twitter. I have a website, PagerDuty with an I. You can also find me today at booth 214 with my company Chronosphere. We're giving away a lovely Atari Lego set, and I am ready for questions.